Everyone has heard of the Bloody Mary legend, but few have the courage to try it out. Some say it's just a child's prank. Others believe there's something darker behind it. I never thought it could be real, until that night. It all happened when I was still in high school. It was a sleepover at a friend's house. The plan was simple: watch horror movies, eat pizza, and tell scary stories. But as with any party like this, someone suggested the worst idea possible. Let's summon Bloody Mary. At first we laughed. It was a joke, right? Just an old urban legend. But there was something about that night, something about the way the lights in the room flickered slightly in the wind outside, that made everything a little more tense. Two girls refused to participate, saying they didn't want to play with that stuff. But the rest of the group, myself included, decided to go ahead. We went upstairs to the bathroom, giggling nervously. The only light came from a small candle we'd placed on the sink. Her reflection danced in the mirror, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was cooler inside, and each of us felt it. It was as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees as soon as we walked in. We closed the door and looked at the mirror. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. For a moment, nothing happened, just the sound of our breathing and the slight flicker of the candle flame. Someone laughed to break the silence, but it was a forced laugh, full of nervousness. We were about to leave the bathroom when the candle went out on its own. The bathroom plunged into complete darkness. The silence became heavy, suffocating. Then we heard a sound, a scratching sound, coming from inside the mirror. I tried to light the candle again, but my hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the match. When I finally managed to do so, the flame illuminated the mirror once more. That was when I saw it. Someone was there. It wasn't a reflection of anyone in the room. It was a woman with long, disheveled hair, empty eyes, and a crooked smile. Her face was covered in dark stains, like dried blood, and her eyes were staring straight into mine. I screamed, and the candle fell to the floor, going out again. The door wouldn't open. The air seemed to thicken, as if something were pushing us against the walls. My friend screamed beside me, but it all seemed distant, as if the sound were being muffled. And then, out of the darkness, her voice came. "You called me. Now you can't run away." Her voice cut through the darkness, low and drawn out, as if it were coming from all sides at once. "You called me. Now you can't run away." Each word seemed to weigh heavily on the air, tightening our chests, making it difficult to breathe. I stepped away from the mirror, tripping over something on the floor, while my friends desperately banged on the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The candle flame lit up on its own for an instant, illuminating the mirror again. She was still there. Her empty eyes stared at me, but now she was no longer inside the mirror. She was outside. My mind froze. It was impossible, but there she was, her disheveled hair covering part of her face, her long, dark nails scraping lightly on the surface of the mirror, as if she were about to leave completely. She was smiling. I screamed again, the sound tearing from my throat, but it seemed like no one else could hear us. Everything outside the bathroom was completely silent, as if the world outside had disappeared. Her voice came back, closer now. "Someone will stay with me." The lights flickered, and the next second, the mirror cracked by itself, a huge crack spreading across the glass. A cold wind blew into the bathroom, lifting hair and blowing out the candle once more. That's when one of my friends managed to open the door with a desperate tug. We ran out, stumbling down the hallway and down the stairs, without looking back. My heart was pounding in my chest, as if it were going to explode. We ran to the living room, where the other girls were, and locked the door. Everyone asked what had happened, but I couldn't say anything. All I could think about was her eyes, the wrong smile that seemed to follow me even now. We tried to pretend that everything was okay. We tried to watch a movie and forget what had happened, but no one could relax. Time seemed to drag, and every noise in the house made us jump in fright. Then we heard the glass breaking upstairs. I knew exactly what it was. I knew it was the mirror. I was the only one who went up to check. My heart told me not to go, to just leave the house and never come back, but my legs kept moving. The hallway was dark, the only sound the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. When I reached the bathroom door, I stopped. The door was open, and the light inside was flickering. The mirror lay shattered on the floor, but in the middle of the shards, I saw something that made my entire body freeze. Footprints, small, wet footprints, as if someone had just left the place, heading in the same direction I had come from. They stopped right behind me. The air grew cold again, and a voice whispered, so close I could feel its icy breath on my ear. "You called me. It's too late now." The light went out, and everything went dark. I don't know how many of you have heard the story of the Mothman, but if you haven't, maybe it's better not to know. The first time I heard this name was through my grandfather. He always told me that some things appear to warn us of the worst, but that not all signs should be ignored. I never took this seriously until I witnessed something that changed my life forever. It all happened a few years ago when I went to visit Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a quiet town, but known for something that no tourist likes to admit: the legend of the Mothman. Some say he appears before major disasters. Others claim that it is just a myth to scare children. But that night, I discovered that he is much more real than anyone would like to believe. It was winter, the air was cold, and fog covered the streets, making everything darker and quieter than usual. I was driving along the road that leads to the old Silver Bridge, where the 1967 disaster occurred. The original bridge had collapsed, killing 46 people, and since then, rumor has it that the Mothman had been seen in the days leading up to the accident. I was curious, perhaps too curious, and decided to drive there alone in the middle of the night, just to see what the place was like. At first, it looked like just a deserted road. Trees towered on either side, their bare branches casting dark shadows in the headlights. But as I got closer to the river, the silence grew eerie, almost heavy. Even the sound of tires on asphalt seemed muffled. That was when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow on the road, a fallen branch, but then its eyes opened, two red dots glowing in the darkness, staring right at me. My heart stopped for a second. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, but those eyes didn't blink. They were just watching me, and then the thing moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it flew. The wings were huge, so big that they seemed to cover the entire road, and the sound of them flapping in the air was like heavy fabric being ripped. He rose into the air and passed over my car, and for a second, the whole world seemed to go silent. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing else, but he was right behind me, following the car. I stepped on the gas, my heart racing like never before. The speedometer was climbing, but it seemed like the faster I went, the closer it got. The thing made no sound, other than the heavy beating of its wings. Its red eyes were the only thing I could see in the rearview mirror, fixed on me, illuminating the darkness like two headlights from hell. Fear filled my body. I knew I shouldn't look back, but it was impossible to help myself. Every time I looked away for a second and looked back, it got closer. One moment, it was several meters away. The next, it was almost touching the rear window. The road seemed to stretch out in front of me. The world around me was plunged into darkness and silence, as if the night itself had stopped to watch. The air inside the car was thick, hard to breathe. I tried to focus on the road, but my instincts told me that something terrible was about to happen. That's when it disappeared. Without warning, without sound, without a trace. It just vanished into thin air. The relief lasted only a few seconds. Suddenly, the car radio turned on by itself, static filling the cabin. The frequency changed on its own, as if someone were trying to tune in. The noise grew louder, higher and higher, until a voice came, muffled and drawn out. "Watch out." I slammed on the brakes. The car slid off the road, and the world seemed to spin around me. The radio went silent, the engine stalled, and everything went silent again. I tried to start the car again, but the key wouldn't turn. My entire body was shaking, and the air seemed to have grown colder. Then I heard a tapping on the roof. 1, 2, 3. Each tap was slow and heavy, as if something was walking over the top of the car. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the windshield, waiting to see something I knew I didn't want to see. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. Silence returned, but the air was still heavy. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time and saw a shadow moving away across the sky, its wings spreading like a curtain of darkness, disappearing toward the river. The car started on its own. The engine roared, and I wasted no time. I accelerated as fast as I could, without looking back again. When I finally reached the city, I stopped the car and stood there, breathing heavily, trying to understand what had just happened. The next morning, I went to a local store and asked one of the older residents if he had ever heard of anything like this. The man, an old man with white hair and tired eyes, looked at me for a few seconds before answering. "You've seen the Mothman." I tried to laugh, to pretend I wasn't scared, but he didn't smile. He just shook his head and said, "Every time he shows up, something bad happens." 3 days later, a bridge in the neighboring city collapsed. 20 people died in the accident. I never went back to Point Pleasant, but sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I look in my rearview mirror and wonder if those red eyes are still around, waiting to appear again. Because one thing is for sure, the Mothman never warns without warning. I never believed in urban legends. I always thought they were stories made up to scare children, until it happened to me, until I saw something that should never exist, something that changed the way I see the world. And, believe me, after that, I could never sleep the same way again. That was a few years ago, when I lived in a small town, surrounded by a dense forest. We used to explore the woods after school. 2 friends and I were inseparable, and the forest was our favorite place. We knew every path, every fallen tree, every hidden trail. At least that's what we thought. That day, something was different. The air seemed colder than usual, even though the sun was still high. The shadows between the trees were longer, and the silence around us was heavy. No birds, no sound of wind, nothing. Just the sound of our footsteps on the dry earth. We were almost to the clearing where we used to play when my friend suddenly stopped. He stared into the trees, his breath caught in his throat. I asked him what he had seen, but he didn't answer. He just raised his hand and pointed. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then he appeared, too tall, too thin. Standing between the trees, a faceless man, wearing a black suit, his arms abnormally long and motionless at his sides. My heart stopped. My mind tried to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. He was far away, but it seemed like he was watching us, even though he didn't have eyes. For a few seconds, no one moved. Time seemed to have stopped. The air became dense, and I felt the weight of something invisible pushing us to the ground. That was when he took a step forward. It wasn't a normal step. It was as if he glided, without moving his feet, getting closer in the blink of an eye. My friend screamed, and that was enough to break the spell. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life. The sound of our footsteps was like thunder in the woods, branches breaking beneath our feet, the air rushing in and out of my lungs in desperate gulps. I didn't look back. I knew I shouldn't. I felt that if I did, I wouldn't be able to escape. We reached the road panting, our hearts almost beating out of our throats. My vision was blurred with tears, and my ears were ringing. I looked around, trying to find my friend, but he wasn't there. I screamed his name. No answer. And then, at the edge of the forest, between the shadowy trees, I saw a shadow moving slowly, disappearing into the darkness. My friend was never found again. The search began that very night. Police, firefighters, and volunteers searched the forest for hours, but found no sign of my friend. No footprints, no clothing, no sound. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The only thing I could say was, he was there. The tall figure, the blank face, the black suit. They thought I was in shock, that my mind had made it up as a way to cope with the disappearance. But I knew the truth. Slender Man was real. The weeks dragged on, and the search slowed down until it stopped altogether. The townspeople avoided the subject, pretending nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget. The nights became unbearable. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the trees, his long arms outstretched, waiting. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling. The room was dark, but the air felt colder than usual. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It was then that I noticed the shadow in the window. At first, I thought it was a reflection. It took my eyes a while to adjust to the dim light, but when the shadow moved, my heart stopped. It was him. His expressionless face stared back at me through the glass. I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. He didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. And then, he raised his hand. The movement was slow, almost gentle. His palm touched the glass, and a cold mark was left in its place. My body finally reacted, and I rolled out of bed, stumbling to the door. I ran through the house, not looking back. My parents woke up to my screams, but when we returned to the room, he was gone. The mark on the glass had also disappeared. After that, we moved to another city. My parents thought it would be best for all of us, that a fresh start would help me forget what happened, but I never did. Even years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night with the same feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes I see shadows in the corner of the room. Other times, I swear I hear soft footsteps outside the window, and on quieter nights, I hear a soft tapping on the glass. 3 taps, always 3. I don't look anymore. I don't have to look to know who's there. He never leaves. If you grew up in New York City, you've probably heard the story about alligators living in the sewers. Some say it's just an urban legend, something to scare tourists or kids who aren't afraid of anything. But I know the truth, because I was there, and what I saw that night will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was working as an intern at an underground maintenance company. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Once a week, we had to go down into the drainage tunnels to check the pipes and make sure there were no blockages. I'd always been told not to go alone, especially in the older parts of the city, where the tunnels were narrow, damp, and poorly lit. But that night, I made the mistake of ignoring the warning. It was around 11 o'clock at night when I climbed down into the entrance of a tunnel near the Bronx. The air was thick, humid, and thick with the smell of ancient decay. The flashlight I was carrying only illuminated a few feet ahead, leaving the shadows to fill the rest of the way. Everything was too quiet. The only sound was the water dripping from the walls and the echo of my own footsteps. I continued walking down the tunnel, following the flow of water until I reached a fork. That was when I heard the first noise, a slow splash in the water. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it down the dark corridor. At first I thought it was just a rat. There are plenty of them down there. But the sound was different, heavier, like something much larger was moving. I took a step back, my heart racing. The water around me began to churn, small ripples forming as if something was approaching, deep below the surface. Suddenly, I saw eyes, 2 yellow orbs, glowing in the darkness, fixed on me a few feet away. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but then he slowly emerged from the water, his mouth full of sharp teeth slowly opening, revealing a row of razor-sharp fangs. The crocodile was huge, much larger than anything I had ever seen in a zoo. The air turned cold. My body froze for a few seconds, paralyzed by terror. I knew I had to run, but my legs wouldn't move. That was when he made his first lunge toward me, the water exploding around him. That was enough to wake me up. I spun around and started running, like I had never done before, slipping in the water, tripping over pipes, and nearly falling several times. I could hear his footsteps behind me, the sound of his giant paws squishing the water. With every turn I made, he got closer. His heavy breathing echoed through the tunnels, and the sound of his claws scraping the concrete made my stomach churn. Finally, I saw the light of the exit ahead. I gathered all the strength I had left and ran as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard a final muffled roar, and then silence. I climbed the iron ladder and slammed the iron lid shut with a bang, panting and shaking. I stood there for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew I couldn't tell anyone about this. Who would believe me? But that night, I decided I would never go back into the tunnels again, because something lives down there, something very real, and if it's hungry, it won't think twice about coming up to the surface. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? A giant crocodile living in the sewers of New York. It sounded like something out of a bad movie, but for the next few days, I couldn't forget what I saw. The roar of the water, the yellow eyes in the darkness, the sound of claws scratching the concrete. It all kept repeating itself in my head, like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I thought that, with time, I would get over it, but then things started to get strange. Some colleagues mentioned unexplained disappearances in the areas near the tunnel where I had been. A dog mysteriously disappeared while walking near a sewer. Then there was a homeless man who used to sleep under the nearby bridge. No one could find any trace of them. I tried to ignore it. I tried to move on with my life and forget what I had seen. But one night, on my way home, I passed by one of the sewer entrances in the same area. The air was different, colder than usual. There was a strange smell in the air, metallic, mixed with something rotten. That was when I heard that sound again. The same slow splash, the same heavy movement in the water. My heart raced, and I froze in place. The water in the drain began to churn, small waves forming. Then the eyes appeared again, glowing in the darkness, fixed on me. This time, I didn't wait to see more. I ran to the other side of the street, my mind screaming that I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I ran, I could hear the sound of paws squelching in the water, following me through the tunnels below. The sound echoed through the streets, as if the ground itself was alive, following my every step. I didn't stop until I reached my house, locking the door behind me, panting, my entire body shaking. I stared out the window, trying to convince myself that I was safe, but I couldn't calm myself. And that's when I saw the manhole cover in the middle of the street move, slowly. It lifted a few inches, rotating as if something was trying to get out. My stomach churned. Whatever was down there didn't want to stay hidden any longer. The phone rang, snapping me out of my trance. It was one of my co-workers, talking about an emergency inspection in the same tunnel I'd been in. Something was blocking the main passage, and they needed to clear it. He asked me to join the crew the next day, but my response was immediate. I'm not going back down there. The next day, they went down without me. When they came back, none of them wanted to talk about what had happened. The supervisor locked the inspection records, and everyone involved was transferred to other areas. The only thing I heard was a whisper from one of the older workers. They found something that should have stayed buried forever. Since then, I've avoided manholes and have never gone near sewer inlets again. But sometimes, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that distant sound, the splashing of water and claws scraping against concrete. And I always wonder how long it will be until he finally rises to the surface. Driving at night has never been a problem for me. I always liked the silence of empty roads, the distant lights blinking in the distance, and the cold wind blowing through the window. But that night, something changed, and I have never driven alone again since. It was a Friday, shortly after midnight. I was driving home after visiting a friend in a nearby town. The road was deserted, lit only by the headlights of my car and the pale light of the moon. The radio was off, and everything seemed calm, until, on the shoulder of the road ahead, I saw a figure standing there. It was a young woman, wearing a white dress that seemed too light for the cold of that night. Her back was to me, her face partially covered by her hair dancing in the wind. Instinctively, I slowed down. Something about the way she was standing there, alone in the middle of nowhere, made me believe she needed help. I pulled over next to her and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" I asked. She turned slowly, her large, dark eyes shining in the headlights. Her expression was calm, almost sad. "I'm trying to get home." There was something in her voice, soft and mesmerizing, that made me forget any hesitation. Without thinking much, I offered her a ride. She nodded silently and got in the car. For the first few minutes, we sat in silence. The smell of jasmine filled the interior of the car, something sweet, almost familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. When I asked where she lived, she gave me the name of a street a few miles away. Her voice sounded distant, as if it were coming from far away. As we drove down the road, we began to talk. She spoke of simple things, the weather, the city, her childhood memories. There was something nostalgic in her words, as if she were reliving old memories. I felt more and more at ease, but a part of me couldn't ignore the strange chill that seemed to have invaded the car since she got in. That was when I looked at the seat next to me, and my heart sank. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty. The scent of jasmine had disappeared, and the air grew heavier. I braked abruptly, the tires screeching on the asphalt, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around desperately, but there was no one there. And then, on the seat next to me, I saw a neatly folded white scarf, something that had not been there before. Next to it, a small note, handwritten in delicate script. "Thanks for the ride. Now I can finally rest." I stood there, staring at the white scarf and the note on the passenger seat, not knowing what to think. My heart was still pounding, and my breathing was ragged. It was impossible. She had been there for just a few seconds, talking to me. How could she have disappeared like that? I picked up the scarf with trembling hands. The fabric was soft and cool, as if it had been left there for a long time. The note, however, was even more disturbing. "Now, I can finally rest." It didn't make sense. Who was she? And why did everything seem so surreal, as if I were trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from? I tried to calm myself down and got back behind the wheel. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was too tired, and it was all just a hallucination. But as I drove through the deserted streets, that jasmine scent invaded the car again. Subtle at first, but growing stronger and stronger until it became suffocating. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a second, I saw her again. She was sitting in the back seat, her pale face illuminated by the dim light of the street lamps. Her empty eyes stared straight at me, unblinking. I couldn't move. The air inside the car turned cold, and the silence was broken by a whisper. "You brought me back. But it's not the end yet." Her words echoed in my head, repeating themselves like a mantra. Dread gripped me. I slammed the brakes and turned to the back seat. She was gone. I opened the door and ran out into the street, panting, looking around, but there was no one there. The scent of jasmine was gone, as were the scarf and the note on the passenger seat. The road was deserted and silent, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I couldn't get it out of my head. I asked some locals about the young woman in the white dress. Then an elderly woman told me an old story. "Have you seen Mary?" My stomach turned. "Mary?" I asked. She explained that decades ago, a young woman named Mary had died in a car accident on that very road. Since then, several people have reported giving her rides, each describing the same thing: the white dress, the smell of jasmine, the sudden disappearance. She appears to those who need a warning, or to those who are about to encounter something they shouldn't. I have never driven down that road at night since, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the car, I smell that same sweet jasmine scent. And every time I do, I don't look in the rearview mirror. I know she's still there, waiting for me to take her home again.